A physician's hands, steady as stone, reach for instruments that would make modern surgeons recoil in horror. The year is 3047, and what passes for medicine would be considered torture today. But these weren't madmen. They were the most learned healers of their time, following practices passed down through centuries. What they believed would save lives often sealed fates in ways more terrifying than the diseases themselves. A physician's hands, steady as stone, reach for instruments that would make modern surgeons recoil in horror. The year is 1347, and what passes for medicine would be considered torture today. But these weren't madmen. They were the most learned healers of their time, following practices passed down through centuries. What they believed would save lives often sealed fates in ways more terrifying than the diseases themselves. Brother Thomas rises before dawn in the monastery of St. Bartholomew, his sandaled feet silent against cold stone floors. The morning air carries the scent of incense mixed with something else, something metallic and sour, that clings to the medical chambers like a persistent shadow. As the monastery's chief physician, Thomas has dedicated his life to healing the sick, following the teachings of Galen and Hippocrates with the devotion of a true believer. His first patient waits in the infirmary, a young merchant's daughter burning with fever. Her parents have traveled 3 days to reach the monastery, bringing with them their most precious possession and their last hope. Thomas examines her with gentle hands, noting the flush of her cheeks, the rapid pulse, the way her breath comes in shallow gasps. According to his training, according to everything he has learned from the greatest medical minds of his time, the diagnosis is clear: an excess of hot, wet humors poisoning her blood. The treatment follows ancient protocol. Thomas prepares his instruments with meticulous care: a sharp bronze blade, still stained from yesterday's patients, a collection of clay vessels to catch what flows forth, and his most prized possession, a small silver box containing mercury, the quicksilver cure that has saved so many souls. He whispers a prayer, not just for the girl's recovery, but for his own hands to be guided by divine wisdom. What Thomas cannot see, what no physician of his era could comprehend, is that his careful preparation is methodically arranging the tools of destruction. The unwashed blade carries invisible armies of infection from patient to patient. The mercury he treasures as a miracle cure is slowly accumulating in his own body, in the bodies of every patient he has treated, turning organs into toxic waste and neurons into dying tissue. The girl's parents watch with desperate hope as Thomas begins the bloodletting procedure. They see a learned man, a servant of God, applying centuries of accumulated wisdom to save their daughter's life. They cannot see that each drop of blood he draws weakens her already struggling body. They cannot see that the mercury he carefully measures will begin its deadly work within hours, attacking her nervous system with the precision of a perfectly designed poison. As the morning light filters through stained glass windows, Thomas works with the confidence of absolute certainty. He has performed this exact procedure hundreds of times. He has saved countless souls using these very methods. In his mind, in the collective mind of medieval medicine, he is wielding the most advanced healing techniques known to humanity. The girl's breathing becomes more labored as the procedure continues. Thomas interprets this as evidence that the evil humors are fighting back, struggling against the purifying treatment. He increases the bloodletting, adds a second dose of mercury, and begins preparations for trepanation, drilling a small hole in her skull to release the poisonous vapors that are clearly affecting her mind. By evening, the merchant's daughter will be dead. Her parents will thank Brother Thomas through their tears, grateful that their child received the finest medical care available, blessed that she died in the hands of a holy healer rather than suffering alone. Thomas will record her death in his medical journal as another victory against the forces of disease, noting that her soul was successfully purified even as her earthly vessel succumbed to God's will. This is the healer's paradox that defined medieval medicine: absolute compassion married to absolute ignorance, creating a system where the most caring physicians became unwitting agents of death. But Thomas had no idea that his most trusted remedy was slowly poisoning every patient he touched, and that the very foundations of his medical knowledge were built upon centuries of beautiful, deadly lies. The merchant's daughter was not the first to die under Brother Thomas's care, and she would not be the last. But her death reveals something far more sinister than individual medical failure. It exposes an entire civilization's surrender to supernatural explanations that would doom millions to preventable suffering. Step inside the mind of a medieval physician. and you enter a world where the human body exists as a battleground between divine forces and demonic influences. Every symptom, every disease, every mysterious ailment is interpreted through a lens so fundamentally flawed that it transforms healers into executioners and wisdom into weapons of mass destruction. The foundation of medieval medicine rests upon the ancient Greek theory of the four humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. According to this doctrine, which dominated medical thinking for over 1,000 years, perfect health requires these four substances to in perfect balance within the human body. When Brother Thomas examines his patients, he is not looking for bacterial infections or viral invasions, concepts that won't exist for another 500 years. Instead, he sees a cosmic imbalance that must be corrected through bloodletting, purging, and the administration of substances that will restore the body's natural harmony. But the four humours theory is just the beginning of medieval medicine's supernatural foundation. Each humour corresponds to specific elements, seasons, and planetary influences. Blood, associated with air and the planet Jupiter, is considered hot and wet. Phlegm, linked to water and the moon, is cold and wet. Yellow bile connects to fire and Mars, burning hot and dry. Black bile, the most feared of all humours, corresponds to Earth and Saturn, cold and dry, and capable of driving men to madness. When a patient arrives at the monastery gates, Brother Thomas doesn't simply see illness, he sees cosmic disorder. A fever indicates an excess of hot, wet blood that must be drained. Melancholy suggests an overabundance of cold, dry black bile that requires warming treatments. Respiratory problems signal phlegmatic imbalance that demands purging through violent emetics. Every diagnosis becomes an astrological calculation, every treatment a ritual designed to realign the patient's internal universe with the movements of celestial bodies. The terrifying elegance of this system lies in its completeness. No matter what symptoms a patient presents, the four humours theory provides an explanation and a treatment protocol. A child with what we now know as pneumonia receives bloodletting to reduce excess hot humours. An elderly man suffering from what appears to be kidney stones undergoes mercury treatment to balance his cold, dry constitution. A young woman experiencing what we would recognise as depression is subjected to violent purging to eliminate the black bile poisoning her soul. Yet, beneath these divine explanations lurked something far more sinister, a practice so widespread that entire bloodlines would vanish because of it. The medieval physician's toolkit contained remedies that had been passed down through generations, substances considered so powerful that they were reserved for only the most serious cases. Chief among these was mercury, the liquid metal that glowed like captured moonlight, and promised to cure everything from syphilis to madness. Mercury held an almost mystical place in medieval medicine. Alchemists believed it represented the perfect marriage of opposing forces, liquid yet metallic, earthly yet ethereal, capable of dissolving gold and transforming base metals into precious substances. When physicians administered mercury to their patients, they believed they were giving them liquid magic, a substance that could fundamentally transform the human body from diseased flesh into purified vessel. The reality was far more horrifying. Mercury accumulates in human tissue like a patient poison, attacking the nervous system with microscopic precision. Medieval patients who received mercury treatment began experiencing symptoms that their physicians interpreted as signs of healing. Tremors meant the medicine was working, confusion indicated that evil spirits were being driven from the mind, and the characteristic blue line that appeared along the gums was seen as evidence of internal purification. What the physicians couldn't see was that they were creating a generation of walking ghosts. Mercury poisoning progresses slowly, allowing victims to live for months, or even years, while their bodies systematically shut down. Pregnant women passed mercury toxicity to their unborn children, creating bloodlines cursed with neurological disorders that medieval medicine attributed to demonic influence or divine punishment. The supernatural foundation of medieval medicine created a closed system of explanation that protected itself from contradiction. When treatments failed, the failure was attributed to insufficient faith, inadequate purification, or the patient's resistance to divine healing. When patients died, their deaths proved the power of the disease, not the ineffectiveness of the cure. When entire families succumbed to the same mysterious ailments, it confirmed the presence of hereditary sin or demonic infestation. Brother Thomas, like every physician of his era, lived within this system with absolute conviction. He had witnessed mercury cure patients who later died of unrelated causes. proof of the treatment's effectiveness. He had seen bloodletting reduce fevers that might have broken naturally, evidence of the four humours theory. He had observed patients recover from minor ailments after receiving complex treatments that probably had no effect whatsoever. Confirmation of the divine nature of medical intervention. The most chilling aspect of medieval medicine's supernatural foundation was its ability to transform human suffering into divine necessity. Pain became purification, agony became evidence of healing, and death became ultimate cure. Physicians like Brother Thomas could inflict unspeakable torment on their patients while maintaining complete moral certainty, because every scream confirmed the presence of evil being driven from the body. Every convulsion proved that divine medicine was fighting the forces of darkness. What they didn't know was that the cure was claiming more lives than the disease itself, and that their entire understanding of the human body was a beautiful, elaborate, deadly fantasy that would persist for centuries. In the depths of St. Bartholomew's Monastery, Brother Thomas opens a small silver box with the reverence of a priest handling sacred relics. Inside, liquid mercury rolls like captured starlight, its surface mirror-bright and hypnotically beautiful. This is his most precious medicine, more valuable than gold, more trusted than prayer. What he doesn't realize is that he's holding concentrated death in his palm, a substance so toxic that a single spoonful could kill a horse. The mercury cure represents medieval medicine's greatest triumph and most devastating failure. For over 3 centuries, physicians across Europe administered liquid mercury to treat syphilis, believing they were wielding divine power against demonic disease. The logic seemed unassailable. Mercury could dissolve gold, transform metals, and flow like liquid fire. Surely such a miraculous substance could burn away any corruption from human flesh. Watch as Brother Thomas prepares a mercury treatment for Lord Edmund, a nobleman whose body bears the telltale signs of what medieval physicians call the French disease. Edmund's skin erupts in painful lesions, his joints ache with constant fire, and strange growths have begun appearing on his face. According to medical doctrine, these symptoms indicate an excess of hot, corrupt humours that require the cooling, purifying power of quicksilver. Thomas measures the mercury with mathematical precision, enough to coat a silver coin, mixed with honey to make it palatable. He has no way of knowing that he's preparing a dose of poison so concentrated that it will begin destroying Edmund's nervous system within hours. The honey, meant to make the medicine sweet, will only help the mercury absorb more quickly into Edmund's bloodstream, accelerating its journey to his brain. Edmund swallows the mixture without hesitation, trusting in the physician's wisdom and the monastery's reputation. The mercury slides down his throat like liquid silk, already beginning its deadly work within his digestive system. The metal starts to break down, releasing toxic vapors that his body will absorb like a sponge soaking up water. The mercury doesn't cure his syphilis, it simply adds a second, more deadly disease to the first. The progression of mercury poisoning follows a predictable pattern that medieval physicians interpreted as evidence of healing. First comes excessive salivation, which they believed indicated the medicine was drawing out corrupt humours through the mouth. Patients would drool constantly, their saliva taking on a metallic taste that physicians saw as proof of internal purification. What was actually happening was that mercury was attacking the salivary glands, causing them to produce saliva in desperate attempts to flush the poison from the system. Next comes the tremors. Lord Edmund's hands begin to shake uncontrollably, his head develops a rhythmic nod, and his speech becomes slurred and difficult to understand. Brother Thomas observes these symptoms with satisfaction, recording in his medical journal that the mercury is successfully agitating the corrupt humours, forcing them to reveal themselves through physical manifestation. In reality, mercury is systematically destroying Edmund's nervous system, attacking the delicate tissues that control movement and speech. The psychological effects arrive like storm clouds gathering on a clear day. Edmund becomes confused, paranoid, convinced that servants are plotting against him. He experiences vivid hallucinations, seeing demons in shadows, and hearing voices in empty rooms. His personality changes completely. The once gentle nobleman becomes violent and unpredictable, lashing out at anyone who approaches. Brother Thomas interprets these symptoms as evidence that the mercury is driving out evil spirits, engaging in direct combat with the forces of darkness that have possessed Edmund's body. But the most horrifying aspect of mercury poisoning is its longevity. Unlike other medieval treatments that killed quickly, Mercury creates walking corpses who survive for months or even years while their bodies slowly disintegrate. Edmund will live long enough to spread his syphilis to others, to father children who inherit both diseases, to become a living testament to the effectiveness of mercury treatment, even as it destroys him from within. The blue line appears along Edmund's gums like a badge of honor. Medieval physicians called this the mercurial line, and its presence confirmed that the treatment was working. Patients who developed the blue line were considered successfully treated, their bodies marked by divine intervention. What they were actually seeing was mercury accumulation in soft tissue, a clear sign of chronic poisoning that would have alarmed any modern physician. As weeks pass, Edmund's teeth begin to fall out. His hair turns grey and brittle, breaking off in clumps. His skin takes on a greyish pallor, and strange rashes appear across his body. Brother Thomas documents all of these symptoms as signs of successful treatment, evidence that the mercury is drawing corruption from Edmund's internal organs and expelling it through his skin. The tragedy deepens when we consider the scale of mercury treatment. Every major medical center in Europe maintained stocks of quicksilver. Thousands of physicians prescribed it daily. Entire generations of patients received regular mercury doses for conditions ranging from melancholy to madness. The cumulative effect was a continent-wide poisoning event that killed more people than the diseases it claimed to cure. Mercury didn't just poison individual patients, it poisoned bloodlines. Pregnant women who received mercury treatment passed the toxicity to their unborn children, creating babies born with neurological disorders that would plague them for life. These children, when they reached adulthood, would be more susceptible to mental illness, physical deformity, and early death. Their children in turn would inherit weakened constitutions that medieval medicine attributed to original sin or demonic curse. The mercury cure created its own mythology of success through selective observation and willful ignorance. Physicians like Brother Thomas remembered the patients who survived mercury treatment. Forgetting those who died, they attributed recovery to their medical intervention, while blaming death on the severity of the disease. They created elaborate theories to explain away the obvious toxicity of their most trusted remedy, transforming evidence of poisoning into proof of healing. Lord Edmund dies on a cold February morning, his body finally succumbing to the double assault of syphilis and mercury poisoning. Brother Thomas records his death as a victory against the forces of evil, noting that Edmund's soul was purified through suffering, and his body cleansed through divine intervention. The mercury treatment is declared successful, and Thomas begins preparing the same dose for his next patient. In the apothecary's ledger, the word cure appeared 84 times, the word death appeared 1,200 times, but the physicians never made the connection, never questioned why their most effective medicine seemed to require so many funerals. The sound that haunts the monastery's medical chambers is not the screaming patients learn quickly, that screaming brings more aggressive treatment. It's the steady drip of blood into clay vessels, a rhythm as constant as rainfall, as inevitable as death itself. Brother Thomas has calculated that he has drained over 3,000 gallons of human blood during his 20 years of service, believing each drop brings his patients closer to divine health. Bloodletting represents the cornerstone of medieval medical practice, a treatment so fundamental that physicians measured their skill by how efficiently they could drain a human body. The theory behind bloodletting seems almost elegant in its simplicity. Illness results from an excess of corrupted blood, so removing the tainted blood will restore health. What medieval physicians couldn't see was that they were systematically weakening already sick patients, turning minor ailments into death sentences through medically sanctioned blood loss. Margaret of Westmarch arrives at the monastery suffering from what modern medicine would recognize as a simple fever, possibly caused by a minor infection. She's tired, slightly warm, and experiencing mild body aches, symptoms that would resolve naturally with rest and proper nutrition. But in Brother Thomas's medical framework, Margaret's condition represents a dangerous accumulation of hot, corrupted blood that threatens to poison her entire system. The bloodletting chamber resembles a medieval torture room, more than a medical facility. Sharp bronze knives, their edges dulled from countless procedures, rest alongside collections of dirty clay bowls and primitive measuring devices. Leeches swim in murky water, their bloated bodies testament to recent feedings. The floor bears permanent stains from procedures gone wrong, dark patches that no amount of scrubbing can remove. Brother Thomas begins Margaret's treatment by selecting his instruments with ritual precision. He chooses a bronze blade that he considers lucky, It has successfully treated over 200 patients, though he doesn't mention that fewer than half of them survived the experience. He positions Margaret's arm over a clay vessel, whispering prayers while he prepares to make the first incision. The cut is deeper than necessary, designed to ensure a steady flow of blood, rather than minimize patient discomfort. Margaret's blood streams into the vessel with alarming speed, its color rich and red, which Brother Thomas interprets as proof of corruption that must be purged. What he's actually seeing is healthy blood flowing from a body that can't afford to lose it, each drop weakening Margaret's immune system and reducing her ability to fight off the very infection he's trying to cure. Medieval physicians had developed elaborate theories about blood quality that justified increasingly aggressive bloodletting. Dark blood indicated an excess of melancholic humors that required extensive draining. Bright red blood suggested sanguine corruption that needed immediate purging. Slow-flowing blood meant the humors were thick and toxic, requiring deeper cuts and longer sessions. Fast-flowing blood indicated dangerous pressure that could only be relieved through massive blood loss. As Margaret's blood flows into the vessel, Brother Thomas monitors her condition with scientific precision. He notes the gradual pallor of her skin, which he interprets as evidence that corrupt humors are being drawn from her internal organs. Her increasing weakness confirms that evil influences are leaving her body. When she begins to faint, he sees proof that the treatment is reaching the deepest levels of corruption. The leeches represent bloodletting's most sophisticated technology. These medical leeches, carefully cultivated in monastery pools, can drain blood with surgical precision while injecting natural anticoagulants that keep wounds bleeding long after the leech is removed. Brother Thomas applies 12 leeches to Margaret's temples, believing they will draw corruption directly from her brain. The leeches attach with hungry efficiency, their bodies swelling as they feed on blood that Margaret desperately needs to fight her infection. What makes bloodletting particularly horrifying is its scalability. A minor fever might require the removal of 1 cup of blood. A serious illness could demand up to 4 cups. Life-threatening conditions justified draining a patient until they lost consciousness, with physicians carefully monitoring the flow to ensure they stopped just short of death. Brother Thomas has performed bloodletting sessions that removed over half of a patient's total blood volume, believing that such aggressive treatment demonstrated his commitment to healing. The tools of bloodletting evolved into instruments of precise destruction. Fleams, specialized knives designed specifically for cutting veins, could create wounds of exact depth and width. Cupping glasses, heated over flames, and applied to punctured skin, created suction that drew blood with mechanical efficiency. Scarificators, devices armed with multiple small blades, could create dozens of bleeding wounds simultaneously, turning the human body into a colander of controlled injury. Margaret's treatment continues for 3 days, with Brother Thomas removing carefully measured quantities of blood at regular intervals. On the first day, he drains 2 cups, noting with satisfaction that the blood appears less corrupted than initially observed. On the second day, another cup and a half, plus an additional session with leeches applied to her neck and wrists. By the third day, Margaret is so weak she can barely lift her head, which Thomas interprets as evidence that the evil humors have been successfully weakened. The psychological aspect of bloodletting created its own feedback loop of apparent success. Patients who survived aggressive bloodletting were considered cured, regardless of their actual condition. Those who died were remembered as victims of diseases so severe that even divine bloodletting couldn't save them. The treatment protected itself from criticism through a twisted logic that transformed every outcome into evidence of medical wisdom. Margaret dies on the 4th day, her body finally succumbing to blood loss, rather than the minor infection that brought her to the monastery. Brother Thomas records her death as a heroic battle against corrupt humors. Noting that she died with purified blood and a cleansed soul, he measures the total blood removed, nearly 6 cups, and records it as a successful treatment that simply couldn't overcome the severity of her condition. The tragedy of bloodletting extends beyond individual deaths, to encompass entire populations weakened by routine medical care. Medieval physicians prescribed regular bloodletting as preventive medicine, draining healthy people to prevent illness. Pregnant women received bloodletting to ensure easy births. Children were bled to promote proper growth. Elderly patients endured regular sessions to maintain their health. The cumulative effect was a civilization systematically weakening itself through medically sanctioned blood loss. But blood wasn't the only thing medieval physicians believed needed to be drained from the human body. In the darkest corners of their medical philosophy lay an even more terrifying belief that the human skull contained vapors so toxic they could only be released through holes drilled directly into the bone. The drill bit bites into living bone with a sound like grinding teeth, sending white powder cascading onto the monastery floor. Brother Thomas works with steady hands, his face a mask of holy concentration as he bores through Geoffrey's skull. The young merchant writhes against leather restraints, his screams echoing off stone walls until exhaustion reduces them to whimpers. Thomas pauses in his work, not from mercy, but to sharpen his drill bit. The bone is harder than expected. Trepanation, the practice of drilling holes in human skulls, represents medieval medicine's most literal attempt to release the demons they believed caused mental illness. Unlike bloodletting or mercury treatment, trepanation leaves permanent evidence of its horror in the form of circular holes in archaeological skulls, silent testimony to medicine's capacity for sanctified brutality. Geoffrey of Millbrook arrived at the monastery 3 days ago, his family desperate to cure what they described as fits of madness that had begun after a fall from his horse. Modern medicine would recognize Geoffrey's symptoms as traumatic brain injury, confusion, personality changes, and occasional seizures resulting from swelling in his skull. But Brother Thomas sees something far more sinister, demonic possession that can only be cured by drilling a hole in Geoffrey's head to allow the evil spirits to escape. The theory behind trepanation rests on medieval medicine's understanding of the skull as a sealed container that can trap corrupted vapors and malevolent spirits. When a patient exhibits signs of mental disturbance, physicians believe that supernatural forces have entered the head and become trapped inside the bone. The only logical treatment is to create an escape route by boring through the skull, allowing the demons to flee while preserving the patient's soul. Brother Thomas's surgical kit for trepanation resembles a carpenter's toolbox more than medical equipment. His primary instrument is a trephine, a circular drill bit mounted on a wooden handle, designed to cut perfect round holes in bone. Alongside the trephine rest bronze scrapers for cleaning bone fragments from the wound, iron picks for probing the exposed brain, and a collection of herbal poultices that will be packed into the hole once the operation is complete. The procedure begins with Geoffrey strapped to a wooden table, his head immobilized between blocks of wood to prevent movement during drilling. Brother Thomas has shaved Geoffrey's hair and marked the drilling site with charcoal, selecting a location based on ancient texts that map the skull's spiritual geography. According to these texts, holes drilled above the left ear release demons of melancholy, while holes above the right ear expel spirits of rage. Geoffrey's symptoms suggest possession by demons of confusion, requiring a hole directly above his forehead. What Geoffrey experiences during trepanation defies description. Medieval physicians perform the procedure on conscious patients, believing that awareness is necessary for the spiritual aspects of the cure to work properly. Geoffrey feels every turn of the drill as it grinds through his skull, experiences the horrifying sensation of bone dust falling into his eyes, endures the agony of metal tools scraping against his exposed brain tissue. The drilling progresses with mechanical inevitability. Brother Thomas applies steady pressure while rotating the trephine, pausing occasionally to clear bone fragments from the growing hole. Blood flows freely from the wound, but Thomas interprets this as evidence that corrupt humors are being released along with the demons. The sound of drilling bone mingles with Geoffrey's screams and Thomas's prayers, creating a symphony of sanctified torture. When the drill finally breaks through Geoffrey's skull, Brother Thomas peers into the hole with scientific curiosity. He can see Geoffrey's brain pulsing beneath a thin membrane, the grey tissue moving with each heartbeat, like some alien creature trapped beneath the surface. According to medical doctrine, this pulsing indicates that demons are still present, struggling to escape through the newly created opening. The next phase of trepanation involves enlarging and smoothing the hole to ensure proper drainage of evil spirits. Brother Thomas uses bronze scrapers to widen the opening, carefully removing sharp edges that might impede the demon's escape. Geoffrey has stopped screaming, not because the pain has lessened, but because his body has gone into shock. His eyes roll back, showing only white, and his breathing becomes shallow and irregular. Brother Thomas interprets Geoffrey's deteriorating condition as evidence that the treatment is working. The demons are fleeing Geoffrey's body, taking with them the vital forces that animated his flesh. This is expected. Medieval texts warn that trepanation often requires patients to approach death before achieving spiritual purification. The proximity to death is not a side effect of the treatment, but its primary mechanism. forcing demons to abandon their human host rather than risk destruction in the afterlife. The exposed brain tissue presents Thomas with a direct view of what he believes is Jeffrey's soul. Medieval physicians understand the brain as the seat of spiritual essence, the physical location where divine spark meets earthly flesh. By drilling through Jeffrey's skull, Thomas has created a window into the supernatural realm, allowing him to observe the battle between good and evil playing out on the surface of living brain tissue. What Thomas sees through this window depends entirely on his interpretation of normal brain function. The rhythmic pulsing becomes evidence of demonic struggle. Small blood vessels visible beneath the brain's surface are identified as evil spirits, attempting to burrow deeper into Jeffrey's skull. Changes in the brain's color, as Jeffrey's blood pressure fluctuates, are interpreted as signs that divine intervention is driving out supernatural corruption. The final stage of trepanation involves packing the hole with medicinal herbs and covering it with a bronze plate to prevent demons from re-entering Jeffrey's skull. Brother Thomas selects his herbs carefully: wormwood to repel evil spirits, frankincense to attract divine protection, and ground mercury to purify any remaining corruption. These substances are pressed directly into Jeffrey's exposed brain tissue, ensuring that their spiritual properties reach the deepest levels of his consciousness. Jeffrey survives the trepanation procedure, though survival is a relative term. The hole in his skull never properly heals, leaving his brain vulnerable to infection for the rest of his life. The mercury packed into his head tissue causes progressive neurological damage that manifests as worsening seizures and increasing mental confusion. The trauma of the procedure itself creates permanent psychological scars that medieval medicine interprets as evidence of successful demon removal. Brother Thomas records Jeffrey's trepanation as a complete success. The patient's personality has indeed changed. Jeffrey is now docile and compliant, no longer exhibiting the aggressive behavior that brought him to the monastery. His seizures have become more frequent, which Thomas interprets as evidence that remaining demons are being forced to reveal themselves. The progressive deterioration of Jeffrey's mental faculties is seen as proof that evil influences are being systematically expelled from his consciousness. The screams echoing from the monastery's medical chamber told a different story than the physician's confident prayers. But those screams were not considered evidence. In medieval medicine's supernatural framework, patient suffering was spiritual necessity, and the physician's drill was an instrument of divine will. The monastery's surgical chamber houses a collection that would make modern surgeons weep, not from admiration, but from horror at the primitive brutality disguised as healing instruments. Brother Thomas maintains his tools with religious devotion, sharpening blades that have never been properly sterilized, polishing cauterizing irons that glow red-hot in the flame, arranging bone saws and skull drills with the precision of a torturer preparing for his craft. Medieval surgical instruments represent humanity's first systematic attempt to invade the human body with therapeutic intent. But they were designed by people who understood neither anatomy nor infection. Every tool in Brother Thomas's collection is a weapon of accidental destruction, crafted to cut and burn and drill without any comprehension of the microscopic armies of bacteria that coat their surfaces. The centerpiece of Thomas's surgical collection is a cauterizing iron shaped like a cross, its metal shaft worn smooth by countless hands. Medieval physicians believe that burning flesh with red-hot metal serves dual purposes. It stops bleeding through the direct application of heat, and it drives out evil spirits who cannot tolerate the purifying power of fire. What they cannot see is that cauterization destroys healthy tissue along with diseased tissue, creating wounds that heal slowly and poorly while providing perfect breeding grounds for infection. Watch as Brother Thomas prepares to treat William the Fletcher, whose arm bears a deep gash from a hunting accident. In a modern emergency room, William's wound would be cleaned, stitched, and bandaged, healing within weeks with minimal scarring. But medieval surgery operates according to different principles that transform a simple laceration into a life-threatening ordeal. Thomas begins by heating his cauterizing iron in the brazier until it glows like a captured star. The metal reaches temperatures that would melt flesh instantly, far hotter than necessary for any legitimate medical purpose. But medieval surgical doctrine demands that cauterizing irons be heated to maximum temperature to ensure their spiritual effectiveness against demonic influences that might be hiding in wounded tissue. William lies on the surgical table, fully conscious and held down by leather straps and strong arms. Medieval surgery is always performed on awake patients, partly because effective anesthesia doesn't exist, but primarily because physicians believe that consciousness is necessary for the soul to participate in its own healing. William must experience every moment of his treatment for the spiritual aspects of surgery to work properly. The cauterizing iron approaches William's wound with inexorable precision. Thomas has no understanding of surgical technique, no concept of minimizing tissue damage or preserving function. He simply presses the red-hot metal against William's flesh, holding it there until the hissing stops and the smell of burning meat fills the chamber. William's screams reach impossible volume, his body arching against the restraints with strength born of pure agony. The cauterization creates a wound far worse than the original injury. Where William once had a clean cut that might have healed naturally, he now has a crater of destroyed tissue surrounded by severely burned flesh. The heat has killed not only bacteria, a side effect Thomas doesn't understand, but also the healthy cells necessary for proper wound healing. The burn will take months to heal, if it heals at all, and will leave William with permanent scarring and reduced function in his arm. But Thomas's surgical intervention is far from over. Medieval surgical doctrine requires multiple cauterizations to ensure complete purification of wounded tissue. Thomas reheats his iron and applies it again, this time to areas surrounding the original wound. Each application destroys more healthy tissue, creates new sources of infection, and increases William's chances of permanent disability or death. The bone saw represents medieval surgery's most ambitious instrument, designed to remove limbs when cauterization and other treatments fail. Thomas's bone saw looks like a carpenter's tool, because that's essentially what it is, a blade designed to cut through wood, adapted for use on human bone with no modifications for medical purposes. The teeth are large and coarse, designed to tear through material rather than make clean cuts. The handle is wooden, impossible to sterilize, and permanently stained with the blood of previous patients. Medieval amputation follows a protocol that guarantees maximum suffering and minimum survival. The patient is strapped to the surgical table while assistants hold the limb steady. Thomas uses a knife to cut through skin and muscle, working his way around the limb in a rough circle, paying no attention to preserving important blood vessels or nerves. Once the soft tissue is severed, he begins sawing through bone with the same technique you would use to cut firewood. The sawing process can take an hour or more, depending on the thickness of the bone and the sharpness of the saw. Throughout this time, the patient remains conscious, experiencing not only the agony of having their limbs sawed off, but also the psychological horror of watching their body being dismantled piece by piece. Medieval physicians believe this consciousness is medically necessary. The patient's soul must witness the removal of corrupted flesh to understand the spiritual significance of the procedure. Blood loss during medieval amputation is controlled through cauterization, which means Thomas must repeatedly apply red-hot irons to the amputation site, while the patient is still conscious. The combination of sawing and burning creates levels of pain that exceed human comprehension, often causing patients to faint from shock. When patients lose consciousness, Thomas revives them with smelling salts or cold water, ensuring they remain awake for the spiritual aspects of their treatment. The cataract needle represents medieval surgery's attempt to treat eye problems through direct intervention. This thin bronze instrument is designed to be inserted into the eye to push cataracts out of the visual field, a procedure that medieval physicians perform on conscious patients without any pain relief. The needle frequently causes complete blindness, destroys the eye's internal structure, and introduces infections that can spread to the brain. But medieval medicine considers these risks acceptable, because blindness is preferable to the spiritual corruption that cataracts represent. Medieval surgical instruments create their own mythology of success through selective memory and supernatural interpretation. When patients survive surgery, their survival proves the effectiveness of the treatment. When they die, their deaths demonstrate the severity of their condition and the heroic efforts made to save them. When they suffer permanent disability, their disability is interpreted as evidence that evil influences have been successfully removed from their bodies. The most horrifying aspect of medieval surgical instruments is their longevity. Thomas uses the same tools on patient after patient, never cleaning them properly, never understanding that he's carrying infection from one person to the next. His bone saw bears the accumulated blood of dozens of amputations. His cauterizing irons are permanently stained with the charred flesh of countless patients. His needles and knives carry invisible armies of bacteria that transform every procedure into a potential death sentence. Yet even these brutal tools paled in comparison to what physicians did when they believed the soul itself was diseased. when they moved beyond treating the body to attempting direct intervention in the realm of human consciousness. In the monastery's deepest cellar, where sunlight never penetrates and screams cannot escape, Brother Thomas maintains his collection of souls deemed too dangerous for society. Here, chained to stone walls in cells barely large enough for human bodies, live the mad, those whose minds have been claimed by demons, so powerful that only the most extreme treatments can hope to drive them out. Medieval treatment of mental illness represents medicine's descent into sanctified torture, a systematic program of brutality justified by the belief that madness is divine punishment that can only be cured through suffering. What we now recognize as depression, anxiety, schizophrenia, and bipolar disorder were understood as demonic possession requiring exorcism through pain, starvation, and physical brutality. Eleanor of Blackmore occupies the cell closest to the stairs, her wrists rubbed raw from iron shackles that have held her for 8 months. She arrived at the monastery suffering from what modern medicine would recognize as postpartum depression, the crushing sadness and anxiety that followed the death of her infant son. But in Brother Thomas's framework, Eleanor's grief represents demonic invasion that must be driven out through systematic torture, disguised as therapeutic intervention. The theory behind medieval treatment of madness rests on the belief that demons can only inhabit human consciousness when the soul is weakened by sin or spiritual corruption. Mental illness, therefore, is not a medical condition, but a supernatural affliction that requires spiritual rather than physical treatment. The goal is not to heal the mind, but to make the human body so unpleasant that demons will voluntarily abandon their host. Eleanor's treatment begins each morning with what Brother Thomas calls therapeutic fasting, the systematic starvation designed to weaken her body until the demons possessing her mind lose their hold on her consciousness. She receives 1 cup of water and a single piece of moldy bread per day, barely enough to sustain life, but insufficient to maintain the physical strength that demons require to manifest their influence. The starvation produces predictable effects that medieval medicine interprets as signs of successful treatment. Eleanor becomes increasingly weak and confused, her thoughts scattered and her speech slurred. Thomas records these symptoms as evidence that the demons are losing their grip on her mind. What he's actually observing are the effects of malnutrition on brain function, the same cognitive deterioration that occurs in any starving person. Physical restraint represents another cornerstone of medieval madness treatment. Eleanor spends 23 hours per day chained to the wall, her movement restricted to a radius of 3 feet. The chains are intentionally uncomfortable, designed to prevent sleep and maintain constant physical discomfort. Medieval physicians believed that demons draw power from physical comfort, so making the body as uncomfortable as possible will eventually force supernatural entities to seek more pleasant accommodations elsewhere. The psychological effects of prolonged chaining create their own cycle of apparent therapeutic success. Eleanor begins exhibiting behaviors that her keepers interpret as demon manifestation. She talks to herself, rocks back and forth, and sometimes screams without apparent cause. These behaviors, which are actually normal responses to sensory deprivation and social isolation, confirm to Thomas that his treatment is forcing the demons to reveal themselves. Cold water therapy represents medieval medicine's attempt to shock demons out of human consciousness through temperature extremes. Several times per week, Thomas has Eleanor dragged from her cell and subjected to alternating baths of ice-cold and boiling water, believing that rapid temperature changes will make her body uninhabitable for supernatural entities. The thermal shock causes Eleanor's body to go into convulsions, which Thomas interprets as demons struggling to maintain their grip on her consciousness. The reality of cold water therapy is systematic torture disguised as medical treatment. Eleanor's body temperature fluctuates wildly, causing hypothermia followed by hypothermia in dangerous cycles. Her cardiovascular system struggles to cope with the extreme temperature changes, and her skin develops frostbite and burns from the repeated exposure. But medieval medicine considers these physical effects secondary to the spiritual battle being waged for Eleanor's soul. Beating represents the most direct form of medieval madness treatment, based on the belief that demons cannot tolerate physical pain and will flee from bodies that experience sufficient suffering. Eleanor receives regular beatings with leather straps, wooden clubs and iron rods, administered with scientific precision to maximize pain while avoiding immediate death. Each blow is accompanied by prayers and exorcisms, transforming the violence into religious ritual. The beatings create a feedback loop of apparent success that protects the treatment from criticism. When Eleanor cries out during beating sessions, Her screams are interpreted as demons being driven from her body. When she becomes quiet and submissive, her compliance proves that the treatment is successfully weakening demonic influence. When she exhibits signs of trauma and dissociation, these symptoms confirm that supernatural entities are losing their hold on her consciousness. Sexual assault forms an unspoken but systematic part of medieval madness treatment, justified by the belief that demons of lust can only be expelled through physical violation that makes the body repugnant to supernatural entities. Eleanor, like many female patients in medieval asylums, endures regular rape disguised as medical procedure, performed by physicians who believe they are conducting therapeutic intervention rather than committing assault. The monastery's treatment of madness extends beyond individual patients to encompass entire families affected by mental illness. Children who exhibit unusual behavior are separated from their parents and subjected to the same treatments as adults. Pregnant women showing signs of mental disturbance are chained in positions that threaten their unborn children. Elderly patients suffering from dementia are treated as demon-possessed rather than suffering from age-related cognitive decline. Eleanor's treatment continues for over a year, during which time her physical and mental condition deteriorates steadily. The combination of starvation, torture, and isolation transforms a grieving mother into a broken shell who barely resembles her former self. Medieval medicine interprets this transformation as evidence of successful demon removal. Eleanor's personality has changed completely, proving that supernatural entities have been driven from her consciousness. The most chilling aspect of medieval madness treatment is its institutional nature. Every monastery maintains facilities for treating the mad. Every physician receives training in techniques for driving out demons. Every community participates in identifying and delivering mentally ill individuals to medical authorities. The systematic torture of the mentally ill is not an aberration, but a central feature of medieval medical practice. When Eleanor finally dies in her cell, her death is recorded as a victory against the forces of evil. Brother Thomas notes in his journal that she died with her soul purified, her mind cleared of demonic influence, her body transformed from a vessel of corruption into a sanctified temple. The demons that possessed her have been successfully expelled, proving the effectiveness of therapeutic suffering in treating supernatural affliction. But the physicians weren't finished. They had discovered something they believed was even more dangerous than madness: the corruption that occurred when new life entered the world through the mysterious process of birth. Blood pools on straw-covered floors, while screams echo off stone walls, creating a symphony of agony that medieval physicians interpret as the natural music of childbirth. In the monastery's birthing chamber, Sister Agatha labors to bring life into the world, while Brother Thomas prepares instruments that will likely ensure her death. Medieval obstetrics represents medicine's most devastating failure, transforming the natural process of birth into a medical emergency that kills mothers and babies with unprecedented efficiency. Medieval understanding of pregnancy and childbirth rests on the belief that women's bodies are fundamentally flawed vessels designed by God to produce life through suffering. Pain during childbirth is not a medical problem to be solved, but divine punishment for Eve's original sin, requiring women to endure agony as payment for the privilege of reproduction. Medical intervention is designed not to reduce suffering, but to ensure that spiritual requirements are met during the transition from womb to world. Sister Agatha has been in labor for 18 hours, her contractions growing weaker as exhaustion and blood loss take their toll. In a modern hospital, her condition would trigger immediate medical intervention, cesarean section, pain relief, careful monitoring of maternal and fetal vital signs. But medieval obstetrics operates according to different principles that require women to suffer completely before physicians will consider intervention. Brother Thomas observes Agatha's labor with clinical detachment, noting symptoms that confirm his understanding of birth as spiritual battle. Her screams indicate that demons of childbirth are fighting to prevent new Christian souls from entering the world. Her bleeding suggests that corrupt humors are being expelled along with the child. Her exhaustion proves that evil spirits are draining her strength in desperate attempts to claim both mother and baby for supernatural purposes. The birthing chamber itself reflects medieval medicine's approach to obstetrics. Straw covers the floor to absorb blood and other fluids, but the straw is never changed between births, creating a breeding ground for infection that claims countless lives. Surgical instruments rest on wooden tables, their surfaces stained with the blood of previous patients and coated with bacteria that will introduce deadly infections into fresh wounds. Holy relics are positioned around the room to provide spiritual protection, but they offer no defense against the medical horrors about to unfold. Medieval obstetric instruments represent adaptive brutality designed to extract babies from women's bodies, regardless of the damage inflicted on either mother or child. Thomas's collection includes iron hooks for grasping fetal skulls, primitive forceps that crush rather than protect, and saws designed to dismember babies who cannot be delivered intact. These tools reflect medieval medicine's willingness to sacrifice individual lives to achieve theoretical medical goals. When Agatha's labor fails to progress naturally, Thomas begins preparing for surgical intervention. Medieval caesarean section is performed exclusively on dying mothers, not to save maternal life but to rescue infant souls for Christian baptism. The procedure involves cutting through abdominal muscles and uterine walls with crude knives, extracting the baby by hand, and leaving the mother to bleed to death on the operating table. Thomas applies his surgical knife to Agatha's abdomen with ritual precision, cutting through skin and muscle while she remains fully conscious. Medieval obstetrics provides no pain relief during caesarean section. Women must experience every moment of the procedure for their spiritual purification to occur properly. Agatha's screams reach impossible volume, as Thomas's knife penetrates deeper layers of tissue, searching for the uterus that contains her child. The surgical technique for medieval caesarean section follows no anatomical logic, reflecting physicians' complete ignorance of female reproductive anatomy. Thomas cuts through whatever tissue he encounters, severing blood vessels and damaging organs while searching blindly for the baby. Blood flows freely from multiple wounds, but Thomas interprets the bleeding as evidence that corrupt humors are being expelled from Agatha's body, along with her child. When Thomas finally locates Agatha's uterus, he cuts through its wall with the same crude technique he uses for abdominal incisions. The baby emerges covered in blood and amniotic fluid, barely alive after the traumatic extraction process. Medieval physicians consider any baby that survives caesarean section to be a miracle of divine intervention, regardless of the mother's condition or the child's long-term prospects for survival. Agatha dies within minutes of the caesarean section, her body unable to survive the massive blood loss and tissue damage inflicted by medieval surgical technique. Thomas records her death as a successful procedure, noting that her soul was purified through suffering, and her child was successfully delivered from demonic influences that threatened to claim it during natural birth. The caesarean section is considered medically successful even though it killed the mother and severely injured the baby. Medieval treatment of pregnancy complications reveals medicine's fundamental misunderstanding of female physiology. Excessive bleeding during pregnancy is treated through additional bloodletting, weakening women who are already losing blood naturally. Morning sickness is interpreted as evidence of demonic possession, requiring exorcism rituals that often include fasting and physical abuse. Pregnancy-related hypertension is seen as evidence of hot humors that must be cooled through mercury treatment and bloodletting. Infant mortality in medieval medical settings reaches catastrophic levels due to practices that systematically poison and injure newborn babies. Immediately after birth, infants receive mercury treatments to prevent demonic possession, poisoning their developing nervous systems before they have a chance to establish normal brain function. They are subjected to bloodletting to prevent excessive sanguine humors, weakening their immune systems during the most vulnerable period of their lives. The tragedy of medieval obstetrics extends beyond individual deaths, to encompass entire bloodlines destroyed by medical intervention. Women who survive childbirth often suffer permanent injuries that prevent future pregnancies or make subsequent births increasingly dangerous. Children born under medieval medical care bear neurological damage from mercury poisoning, weakened constitutions from unnecessary bloodletting, and psychological trauma from witnessing their mothers suffering during birth. Medieval physicians justify the catastrophic mortality rates in their birthing chambers through supernatural explanation that protects their practices from criticism. When mothers die during childbirth, their deaths demonstrate the severity of original sin and the divine punishment required for female reproduction. When babies die, their deaths prove that demonic forces were successfully prevented from claiming innocent souls. When both mother and child survive, their survival confirms the effectiveness of medical intervention against supernatural threats. The birthing chamber becomes a factory of sanctified death, where natural processes are transformed into medical emergencies through systematic intervention. Each birth represents a battle between good and evil, with medieval physicians serving as warriors wielding surgical weapons against supernatural enemies. The screams of laboring women are interpreted as battle cries in the eternal war between heaven and hell, and their deaths are recorded as victories against the forces of darkness. In the birthing chamber, two lives hung in the balance. but the methods meant to save them often destroyed both, creating a medical system that turned the miracle of birth into a predictable tragedy. Small hands press against iron bars as Brother Thomas approaches the children's ward. His medical bag filled with instruments sized for tiny bodies, but no less deadly than those used on adults. Medieval pediatric medicine operates on the principle that children are simply small adults, requiring the same treatments in reduced doses, a philosophy that transforms childhood illnesses into death sentences and turns healing institutions into morgues for the innocent. 8-year-old Peter coughs weakly in his cell, his small body racked with what modern medicine would recognize as pneumonia. His parents brought him to the monastery after 3 days of fever and difficulty breathing, hoping that Brother Thomas's reputation for healing children would save their son's life. They cannot know that medieval pediatric medicine has developed specialized techniques for killing children more efficiently than adult treatments ever could. The theory behind medieval child medicine rests on the belief that children's souls are more vulnerable to demonic influence than adult souls, requiring more aggressive treatment to prevent supernatural corruption. Children's smaller bodies mean that evil spirits can more easily overwhelm their physical defenses, while their innocent minds make them attractive targets for demons seeking pure vessels to inhabit. Medical intervention must therefore be swift, aggressive, and comprehensive to prevent childhood illnesses from becoming gateways for supernatural invasion. Brother Thomas examines Peter with practiced efficiency, noting symptoms that confirm his diagnosis of demonic chest fever. The child's labored breathing indicates that evil spirits are filling his lungs with corrupted vapors. His fever suggests that demons are burning his internal organs from within. His weakness proves that supernatural entities are draining his life force to fuel their manifestation in the physical world. The treatment protocol for childhood pneumonia follows adult procedures, with modifications designed to account for children's smaller bodies and allegedly greater spiritual vulnerability. Peter will receive bloodletting proportioned to his size, only 2 cups instead of the 4 cups an adult would lose. He will be given mercury treatment calculated according to his weight, a smaller dose that will still poison his developing nervous system. He will undergo trepanation if his condition worsens, a hole drilled in his skull to release the demons that are clearly affecting his breathing. Medieval bloodletting of children requires specialized instruments designed for small veins and limited blood volume. Thomas selects his smallest knife, a blade no larger than a fingernail, but sharp enough to open Peter's tiny arteries. The cutting is more difficult with children. Their veins are harder to locate, their blood vessels collapse more easily, and their bodies go into shock with minimal blood loss. But medieval medicine interprets these difficulties as evidence that demons are fighting harder to maintain their grip on innocent souls. Peter's blood flows into a miniature clay vessel, its volume carefully measured to ensure proper dosage for a child's body. Medieval physicians believe that children's blood is purer than adult blood, making it more effective at carrying away demonic corruption, but also more precious and dangerous to lose. The balance between therapeutic bloodletting and accidental death is narrower with children, requiring greater precision and more careful observation. The mercury treatment for children involves dissolving liquid metal in honey or sweet wine, making the poison palatable to young patients who would otherwise refuse to swallow it. Peter receives his dose without resistance, trusting Brother Thomas's gentle manner and the promise that the medicine will make him feel better. The mercury slides down his throat like liquid silver, already beginning its assault on his developing brain and nervous system. Medieval understanding of childhood development creates additional therapeutic horrors specific to pediatric medicine. Children who fail to grow properly are subjected to stretching treatments designed to encourage proper development. Their bodies literally pulled apart on crude racks until their bones crack and their joints dislocate. Children who exhibit signs of mental slowness receive aggressive mercury treatment to drive out demons that are allegedly preventing proper intellectual development. Trepanation of children follows the same basic procedure as adult skull drilling, but requires modifications for smaller skulls and developing brains. Thomas uses smaller drill bits and applies less pressure, but the fundamental horror remains unchanged. Conscious children experience the agony of having holes bored through their skulls, while physicians seek to release demons that exist only in medical imagination. Peter's treatment continues for 5 days, with his condition steadily worsening as medieval medicine systematically destroys his body's ability to fight infection. The bloodletting weakens his immune system precisely when he needs maximum strength to battle pneumonia. The mercury poisoning attacks his nervous system, making breathing more difficult and reducing his brain's ability to coordinate vital functions. The stress of ongoing medical torture prevents his body from accessing its natural healing resources. On the 6th day, Peter begins showing signs of mercury poisoning that Brother Thomas interprets as evidence of successful demon removal. The child's hands develop tremors, which Thomas records as demons being shaken from his nervous system. Peter becomes confused and disoriented, symptoms that confirm demonic influence is weakening. His speech becomes slurred and difficult to understand, proving that evil spirits can no longer control his tongue. The tragedy of medieval pediatric medicine is amplified by its systematic nature. Every monastery maintains a children's ward where these procedures are performed daily. Thousands of children die annually from treatments designed to save them, their deaths recorded as victories against supernatural forces rather than medical failures. Parents pay premium prices for specialized childcare that amounts to systematic torture and murder of their offspring. Medieval medical texts describe children as requiring different treatments, not because their bodies function differently from adult bodies, but because their souls are allegedly more valuable to supernatural entities. Demonic forces supposedly prefer to inhabit young bodies because children have not yet accumulated the sins that make adult souls less attractive for possession. This belief justifies more aggressive and dangerous treatments for childhood illnesses than would be considered appropriate for adult. Peter dies on the 7th day, his small body finally succumbing to the combined effects of pneumonia and medical treatment. Brother Thomas records his death as a successful expulsion of demonic forces, noting that Peter died with purified blood, cleansed lungs, and a soul prepared for heaven. His parents thank Thomas through their tears, grateful that their son received the finest medical care available and died in the hands of a holy physician. The children's ward becomes a monument to medical ignorance disguised as specialized care. Small bodies line the walls in cells designed for tiny prisoners, each child suffering from diseases that could be easily treated with proper medicine, but are instead transformed into death sentences by therapeutic intervention. The sounds that echo through the children's ward, crying, screaming, labored breathing, and final silence, create a soundtrack of sanctified infanticide. What happened to the children reveals the darkest truth about medieval medicine, that its capacity for destruction increased in proportion to the innocence and vulnerability of its victims, creating a system where those most in need of protection received the most lethal forms of treatment. The cobblestones of Paris run red with blood that has nothing to do with violence, and everything to do with medicine. The year is 1348, and the Black Death stalks Europe like a hungry wolf, claiming lives so rapidly that graveyards overflow and entire villages disappear. In response to this apocalyptic crisis, medieval physicians deploy their most trusted treatments: bloodletting, mercury, and trepanation, transforming plague victims into medical victims and accelerating humanity's march toward extinction. Dr. Malpheus adjusts his leather beak mask and steps into the plague house, his grotesque costume designed to protect him from corrupted vapors, while allowing him to practice medicine on dying patients. The mask's pointed beak contains aromatic herbs that supposedly filter demonic influences from the air, while his waxed leather robes prevent supernatural contamination from touching his skin. What the costume cannot protect against is the physician's own ignorance, which poses a greater threat to plague victims than the disease itself. The plague doctor's appearance creates one of history's most terrifying images: a figure dressed like death itself, moving through communities that are already dying, administering treatments that hasten the very destruction he claims to prevent. Medieval plague doctors become unwitting agents of extinction, their medical interventions transforming a survivable disease into an inevitably fatal condition for anyone unfortunate enough to receive their care. The Black Death arrives in Europe through trade routes that medieval physicians cannot comprehend, carried by fleas that live on rats, a transmission mechanism completely beyond medieval medical understanding. Instead of recognizing plague as a bacterial infection that could potentially be managed through isolation and supportive care, physicians interpret it as divine punishment requiring spiritual treatment through physical purification. Dr. Malpheus enters the first plague house of his morning rounds, where an entire family lies dying in conditions that would horrify modern medical professionals. Bodies are stacked in corners awaiting burial, the living and dead often difficult to distinguish in the dim light. The air is thick with the smell of decay, vomit, and human waste. conditions that create perfect breeding grounds for additional diseases that will kill survivors of the original plague infection. Medieval understanding of plague transmission rests entirely on supernatural explanations that guide physicians toward treatments guaranteed to increase mortality rates. Physicians believe that plague spreads through corrupted air filled with demonic vapors, requiring treatments that purify the air through bloodletting and burning. They understand the disease as divine punishment for collective sin, demanding spiritual remedies administered through physical suffering. The first plague victim Dr. Malpheus examines is Marie, a baker's wife whose body bears the characteristic buboes, swollen lymph nodes that mark plague infection. Modern medicine would recognize these buboes as evidence that Marie's immune system is fighting the bacterial infection, a sign that her body might overcome the disease with proper supportive care. But medieval medicine interprets buboes as demonic manifestations that must be removed through surgical intervention. Dr. Malpheus prepares to lance Marie's buboes with a bronze knife that has never been properly sterilized, having been used on dozens of previous plague victims without cleaning. The lancing procedure involves cutting deep into swollen lymph nodes to drain what physicians believe are corrupted humors, but which are actually immune system responses essential for fighting the infection. By destroying Marie's lymph nodes, Malpheus eliminates her body's primary defense against plague bacteria. The lancing creates wounds that become infected with secondary bacteria, transforming Marie's survivable plague case into a multi-system infection that will kill her within days. Dr. Malpheus interprets the secondary infections as evidence that demons are fighting back against his medical intervention, requiring more aggressive treatment to complete the spiritual purification process. Bloodletting represents medieval medicine's primary weapon against plague. Based on the theory that corrupted blood carries demonic influences throughout the body, Dr. Malpheus drains 3 cups of blood from Marie's weakened body, further compromising her immune system during the critical period when she needs maximum strength to fight the infection. The bloodletting removes not only red blood cells that carry oxygen to vital organs, but also white blood cells that represent her body's army against bacterial invasion. Mercury treatment for plague victims involves administering liquid metal to patients whose digestive systems are already compromised by infection and dehydration. The mercury causes additional symptoms, vomiting, diarrhea, neurological damage, that medieval physicians interpret as evidence that demons are being driven from plague-infected bodies. What they're actually observing are signs of heavy metal poisoning added to the existing plague infection. The combination of plague and mercury poisoning creates a cascade of organ failure that medieval medicine attributes to spiritual warfare between good and evil forces. Dr. Malpheus records detailed observations of patients whose conditions deteriorate rapidly under his care, interpreting their suffering as evidence that his treatments are successfully engaging with supernatural entities responsible for the epidemic. Trepanation of plague victims represents medieval medicine's most desperate attempt to treat what physicians believe is demonic possession manifesting as physical disease. Dr. Malpheus drills holes in the skulls of plague patients who exhibit delirium or confusion, seeking to release evil spirits that are allegedly preventing spiritual recovery. The skull drilling adds traumatic brain injury to the list of medical conditions that plague victims must survive. The plague doctor's daily routine involves moving from house to house, carrying infection on his instruments and clothing, while administering treatments that guarantee death for anyone who might otherwise recover. His leather robes and beak mask become vehicles for disease transmission, spreading plague bacteria from infected families to healthy communities through direct medical contact. Medieval medical response to the Black Death creates a feedback loop of increasing mortality that physicians interpret as evidence of supernatural, rather than medical causation. Communities that receive intensive medical treatment experience higher death rates than communities that are ignored by physicians. But medieval medicine explains this pattern as proof that demons concentrate their attacks on areas where divine healing is being attempted. The mathematical horror of medieval plague treatment becomes clear when mortality statistics are examined. In communities where plague doctors practice aggressive medical intervention, death rates approach 90%. In isolated communities that receive no medical treatment, death rates remain around 30%, still devastating, but representing survival rates that would have allowed European civilization to recover much more quickly from the plague's impact. Dr. Malpheus completes his morning rounds, having treated 15 plague victims with bloodletting, mercury, and surgical intervention. All 15 will be dead within the week, their deaths recorded as evidence of the plague's supernatural power rather than medical system failure. The physician returns to his own quarters, unknowingly carrying plague bacteria on his instruments and clothing, ready to spread the disease to whatever community he visits next. The plague doctor's dance becomes a macabre ballet of sanctified death, where medical professionals move through dying communities, administering treatments that transform survivors into victims. Each house call represents another victory for ignorance over knowledge, another triumph of supernatural explanation over rational observation, another step in medicine's systematic acceleration of human extinction. But even as millions died, the physicians clung to practices that made the plague's work easier, never questioning whether their treatments might be contributing to the very apocalypse they claimed to be fighting. Behind the monastery's main altar, hidden from the eyes of pilgrims and penitents, lies Brother Thomas's apothecary, a chamber that resembles an alchemist's laboratory more than a pharmacy, where substances too dangerous for modern medicine sit alongside herbs that could actually heal, creating a toxic lottery where patients gamble their lives on the physician's ability to distinguish medicine from poison. The shelves of Thomas's apothecary tell the story of medieval pharmacology through their deadly contents. Jars of liquid mercury that glows like captured moonlight, bottles of arsenic powder that physicians believe can cure everything from syphilis to melancholy, vials of lead acetate sweetened with honey to make it palatable to children, and containers of antimony that promise miraculous healing while delivering systematic poisoning. Medieval understanding of pharmacology rests on the principle that the most toxic substances possess the greatest healing power, creating a medical system where physicians intentionally administer poisons to sick patients. The logic seems reasonable within medieval medical framework. Diseases represent supernatural corruption that can only be driven out by substances powerful enough to kill demons, and the most poisonous substances are obviously the most spiritually potent. Brother Thomas begins his morning by preparing medications for the day's patients. Measuring doses with the precision of a master poisoner, his most popular remedy is a mercury-based tonic that he prescribes for virtually every medical condition, believing that liquid metal's ability to dissolve gold makes it capable of dissolving any corruption from human flesh. The tonic contains enough mercury to cause permanent neurological damage, but Thomas interprets the resulting symptoms as evidence of successful treatment. The preparation of medieval medications follows no scientific principles, relying instead on astrological calculations, religious symbolism, and supernatural beliefs about the spiritual properties of various substances. Thomas grinds his mercury while reciting prayers, believing that divine intervention will enhance the metal's healing properties. He adds specific herbs based on planetary alignments, mixes ingredients in quantities determined by numerological significance, and stores finished medications in containers blessed by religious authorities. Medieval dosage calculations rest on principles that guarantee either ineffectiveness or toxicity, with no middle ground for therapeutic benefit. Physicians believe that small doses of medicine demonstrate insufficient faith in divine healing, while large doses prove the physician's commitment to patient recovery. Thomas typically prescribes doses that are either too small to have any effect, or large enough to cause severe poisoning, with no understanding of the therapeutic window that makes modern medicine possible. The mercury tonic represents medieval pharmacy's most successful commercial product. Prescribed for conditions ranging from syphilis to depression to childhood developmental delays, Thomas maintains detailed records showing that patients who receive mercury treatment often experience dramatic symptom changes, tremors, confusion, personality alterations, and speech difficulties that he interprets as evidence of demon removal. What he's actually documenting is the progressive neurological destruction caused by heavy metal poisoning. Arsenic preparations occupy a special place in medieval pharmacy as treatments for conditions that physicians believe require the spiritual power of death itself to cure. Thomas administers arsenic to patients suffering from what he considers demonic possession, believing that demons cannot inhabit bodies that are slowly dying from poison. The arsenic causes symptoms, nausea, vomiting, skin lesions, and organ failure that medieval medicine interprets as evidence of supernatural entities being driven from contaminated flesh. The lead-based medications target children specifically, based on medieval beliefs that growing bodies require heavy metals to achieve proper development. Thomas sweetens lead acetate with honey and administers it to children who fail to meet expected growth milestones, believing that the metal's weight will help young bodies achieve proper density. The lead poisoning causes developmental delays, behavioral problems, and cognitive impairment that medieval physicians interpret as evidence of successful demon removal from young souls. Medieval pharmacy operates without any understanding of chemical interactions. creating medication combinations that produce unexpected toxicities far beyond the individual poisons involved. Thomas routinely prescribes mercury and arsenic together, creating synergistic poisoning that attacks multiple organ systems simultaneously. He combines lead and antimony for patients whose conditions seem particularly severe, believing that multiple heavy metals will provide more comprehensive spiritual purification. The apothecary's inventory includes hundreds of substances whose medical applications rest entirely on supernatural beliefs rather than observed therapeutic effects. Crushed pearls are prescribed for melancholy because their white color represents spiritual purity. Powdered gold treats avarice because the metal's incorruptible nature allegedly transfers to patients who consume it. Ground diamonds cure cowardice because the stone's hardness supposedly strengthens weak souls. Medieval pharmacy's most horrifying aspect is its systematic nature. Every apothecary in Europe maintains similar inventories, every physician prescribes similar combinations, every patient receives similar doses of similar poisons. The cumulative effect is continent-wide poisoning disguised as medical treatment, with entire populations suffering from chronic heavy metal toxicity that medieval medicine attributes to various supernatural causes. The preparation of medieval medications involves processes that add additional toxicity to already dangerous substances. Thomas heats mercury in lead vessels, creating vapors that poison anyone in the vicinity while adding lead contamination to the finished product. He mixes arsenic with antimony using bronze tools that introduce copper poisoning to the medication. He stores finished products in clay containers glazed with lead, ensuring that every medication becomes contaminated with multiple toxic metals. Patient response to medieval medications follows predictable patterns that physicians interpret as evidence of therapeutic success. Initial poisoning symptoms, nausea, dizziness, confusion, are seen as proof that demons are being driven from the body. Progressive organ damage, kidney failure, liver dysfunction, neurological deterioration, confirms that supernatural entities are being systematically expelled from contaminated flesh. Death represents ultimate victory over demonic forces, with the patient's soul purified through chemical suffering. The economic aspect of medieval pharmacy creates additional incentives for poisoning patients, as the most expensive medications are invariably the most toxic. Thomas charges premium prices for mercury treatments, arsenic preparations, and lead-based remedies, while simple herbal medicines that might actually provide therapeutic benefit sell for minimal profit. The economic structure of medieval pharmacy rewards physicians for administering poisons, while discouraging the use of potentially helpful treatments. Medieval pharmaceutical texts describe the ideal medication as one that produces dramatic visible effects in patients, leading physicians to prefer substances that cause obvious toxicity symptoms over remedies that work quietly and safely. Thomas's reputation rests on his ability to create medications that produce immediate dramatic changes in patient condition, changes that are actually signs of poisoning, but are interpreted as evidence of supernatural healing power. The apothecary becomes a laboratory for human experimentation, where physicians test increasingly dangerous combinations of toxic substances on patients who have no understanding of the risks involved. Each prescription represents a new experiment in chemical torture, each dose a gamble with death, disguised as therapeutic intervention. In the apothecary's ledger, the word cure appeared 84 times. The word death appeared 1,000 times. But medieval pharmacy never questioned the mathematics of its own failure, never wondered why the most powerful medications seemed to require the most funerals. The monastery's anatomy chamber echoes with sounds that would make modern medical students faint. The scrape of bronze knives against bone, the wet tearing of flesh being separated from muscle, the hollow thud of organs being removed from bodies that still twitch with residual life. Brother Thomas conducts his anatomy lessons on subjects who are technically alive, believing that the educational value of dissection requires consciousness to reveal the spiritual significance of human structure. Medieval anatomical study represents medicine's attempt to understand human structure through direct observation. But the methods employed guarantee that physicians learn incorrect information while committing systematic murder disguised as medical education. The combination of living dissection, supernatural interpretation, and complete ignorance of basic physiology creates an educational system that transforms future physicians into skilled torturers rather than healers. The subject of today's anatomy lesson is Marcus, a condemned criminal whose death sentence has been commuted to serve medical education. Marcus lies strapped to a wooden table, fully conscious and aware that he is about to be dissected alive for the edification of Brother Thomas's students. Medieval legal systems consider this fate more merciful than execution, offering criminals the opportunity to serve God through medical education rather than simply dying for their crimes. Medieval anatomy textbooks, based primarily on the ancient writings of Galen, describe human structure according to theoretical principles rather than direct observation. These texts claim that human bodies contain a network of spiritual channels through which divine essence flows, that certain organs serve supernatural rather than physical functions, and that the arrangement of internal structures reflects cosmic principles rather than biological necessity. Brother Thomas uses Marcus's living body to demonstrate these theoretical concepts to his students. The dissection begins with Marcus's chest, as Brother Thomas uses a bronze knife to cut through skin and muscle, while explaining the spiritual significance of each layer. According to medieval anatomy, the chest contains not only heart and lungs, but also the seat of the soul, the reservoir of spiritual essence, and the battleground where good and evil forces struggle for control of human consciousness. Marcus's screams provide soundtrack to the educational process, confirming that spiritual entities are being disturbed by the anatomical exploration. Medieval understanding of circulatory system rests on the belief that blood flows through the body in spiritual, rather than mechanical patterns, carrying divine essence from the heart to various organs, according to cosmic principles rather than physical pressure. Thomas demonstrates this concept by cutting into Marcus's arteries and observing the blood flow, interpreting the patterns according to astrological calculations rather than anatomical reality. The heart receives special attention during medieval anatomy lessons, as physicians believe it serves as the body's spiritual center rather than a mechanical pump. Thomas removes Marcus's still beating heart, while explaining its role as the seat of courage, the source of love, and the repository of divine spark. The organ continues beating in Thomas's hands, which he interprets as evidence of its supernatural rather than biological nature. Medieval anatomical education requires students to observe the relationship between physical structure and spiritual function, leading to dissection techniques that prioritize symbolic significance over scientific accuracy. Thomas arranges Marcus's organs according to their supposed spiritual hierarchy, placing the heart at the center surrounded by other organs in configurations that reflect medieval cosmology rather than anatomical reality. The nervous system receives primitive attention during medieval dissection, with physicians recognizing that damage to certain structures affects bodily function, but interpreting these observations according to supernatural principles. Thomas probes Marcus's exposed brain with bronze instruments, noting that pressure on different areas causes different types of movement or vocalization. These observations are recorded as evidence of spiritual mapping rather than neurological function. Medieval anatomy lessons extend beyond simple observation to include experimental procedures designed to test theoretical principles about human structure and function. Thomas performs live experiments on Marcus's body, removing organs to observe their effects, cutting nerves to test their spiritual significance, and manipulating internal structures to demonstrate their cosmic relationships. Each experiment provides educational value while ensuring that Marcus dies in the most prolonged and agonizing manner possible. The digestive system receives attention as the body's mechanism for transforming earthly substance into spiritual essence, leading to dissection techniques that prioritize symbolic interpretation over functional understanding. Thomas removes Marcus's stomach and intestines while explaining their role in converting food into the four humours, demonstrating the spiritual alchemy that supposedly occurs within human digestive organs. Medieval anatomical illustration requires artists to attend dissection sessions and create drawings that accurately represent both physical structure and spiritual significance. These illustrations combine realistic anatomical detail with supernatural elements, spiritual channels, cosmic relationships, and divine symbols that reflect medieval understanding of human structure as God's most complex creation. The educational aspect of live dissection extends beyond simple anatomical instruction to encompass spiritual training for future physicians. Students learn not only the physical arrangement of human organs but also their supernatural significance, their astrological correspondences, and their role in the eternal battle between good and evil that occurs within every human body. Medieval anatomy creates its own mythology through selective observation and supernatural interpretation that protects incorrect theories from contradiction by observed facts. When dissection reveals structures that don't match theoretical descriptions, the discrepancies are attributed to individual variation, demonic influence, or divine intervention rather than errors in anatomical theory. Marcus dies after 6 hours of live dissection, his body completely dismantled while his consciousness remained intact to experience every moment of the process. Brother Thomas records the session as highly successful anatomical education, noting that his students learned valuable lessons about human structure, spiritual function, and the divine arrangement of bodily organs. The anatomy chamber becomes a theatre of sanctified torture where medical education occurs through systematic murder disguised as scientific investigation. Each dissection session provides future physicians with incorrect information about human structure, while training them to inflict suffering with clinical detachment and supernatural justification. But the most disturbing discoveries weren't about what they found inside the human body. It was about what they chose to do with that knowledge, and how anatomical understanding became justification for even more elaborate forms of medical torture. In the monastery's chapel, where stained glass windows cast colored light on marble altars, Brother Thomas leads morning prayers for divine intervention in medical treatment, believing that successful healing requires supernatural assistance more than anatomical knowledge or pharmaceutical skill. Medieval medicine's complete integration with religious doctrine creates a system where faith healing replaces practical treatment, where prayer substitutes for surgery, and where patients die while physicians wait for miraculous intervention. Medieval medicine's religious foundation rests on the belief that all disease represents divine punishment for sin, requiring spiritual rather than physical treatment. Physicians serve as intermediaries between patients and God, administering sacraments along with medications, performing exorcisms alongside surgeries, and interpreting medical outcomes according to theological principles rather than clinical observation. The result is a medical system that prioritizes spiritual purification over physical healing. Saint Agatha's relics occupy the place of honor in the monastery's medical collection. Fragments of bone and cloth that supposedly possess miraculous healing properties, capable of curing any disease through direct contact with blessed remains. Brother Thomas uses these relics as his primary therapeutic tools, believing that their spiritual power exceeds any earthly medicine in effectiveness against supernatural causes of illness. The morning's first patient is Catherine, a merchant's daughter suffering from what modern medicine would recognize as appendicitis, a condition that requires surgical intervention but could be successfully treated with proper medical technique. Brother Thomas examines Catherine's symptoms and determines that she suffers from demonic possession that can only be cured through direct application of sacred relics and intensive prayer therapy. Medieval diagnostic technique integrates medical observation with religious interpretation, creating a system where physical symptoms are understood as manifestations of spiritual conditions rather than biological processes. Catherine's abdominal pain indicates that demons are attacking her soul through her digestive system. Her fever suggests that evil spirits are burning her internal organs from within. Her nausea proves that supernatural entities are poisoning her body to weaken her resistance to demonic control. The treatment protocol for Catherine's condition follows religious rather than medical principles, beginning with confession to purify her soul of sins that might be attracting demonic attention. Brother Thomas administers the sacrament of penance while Catherine lies writhing in pain, believing that spiritual purification will eliminate the root cause of her physical symptoms. The confession process requires Catherine to admit to sins she may not have committed, creating guilt and psychological trauma that compound her medical condition. Saint Agatha's relics are applied to Catherine's abdomen with ritual precision, their placement determined by medieval maps of spiritual anatomy that locate different supernatural influences within specific body regions. The bone fragments are wrapped in silk blessed by papal authority, ensuring their maximum spiritual effectiveness against demonic influences. Thomas presses the relics against Catherine's skin while reciting Latin prayers, believing that direct contact will transfer miraculous healing power from saint to patient. The prayer therapy continues for hours, with Brother Thomas and his assistants maintaining constant religious services around Catherine's bedside. They recite specific prayers for abdominal ailments, invoke particular saints known for digestive miracles, and perform ritual blessings designed to create spiritual barriers against demonic attack. The continuous religious activity prevents Catherine from receiving rest that her body needs for natural healing, while the noise and activity increase her stress levels and worsen her medical condition. Medieval exorcism represents medicine's most aggressive form of religious treatment, employed when standard prayer therapy fails to produce immediate results. Brother Thomas begins exorcism procedures on Catherine's second day, believing that her worsening condition indicates stronger demonic resistance that requires direct spiritual combat. The exorcism involves shouting Latin incantations, sprinkling holy water, and making dramatic gestures designed to frighten supernatural entities away from Catherine's body. The exorcism process subjects Catherine to psychological torture, disguised as spiritual healing, with Thomas shouting accusations of demonic possession while she lies helpless in severe physical pain. The ritual creates additional trauma that prevents her body from accessing natural healing resources, while the dramatic religious theatre attracts crowds of observers who treat Catherine's suffering as entertainment rather than medical emergency. Medieval understanding of miraculous healing creates expectations that protect religious medicine from criticism through supernatural explanation of treatment failure. When patients recover after receiving religious treatment, their recovery proves the effectiveness of prayer therapy and relic application. When patients die, their deaths demonstrate the severity of demonic attack and the heroic efforts made by physicians to save corrupted souls. When patients suffer permanent disability, their condition represents divine will rather than medical failure. Catherine's appendicitis progresses to peritonitis, while Brother Thomas continues religious treatment, her infection spreading throughout her abdominal cavity, while physicians focus on spiritual rather than physical intervention. Her increasing pain is interpreted as evidence that demons are fighting harder against exorcism efforts. Her rising fever confirms that evil spirits are being driven from her body through supernatural healing. Her delirium proves that demonic influences are losing their grip on her consciousness. The integration of medical and religious authority creates additional barriers to effective treatment, as questioning medical practice becomes equivalent to challenging religious doctrine. Patients and families who suggest that prayer therapy might be insufficient risk accusations of insufficient faith or demonic influence. Physicians who propose physical treatment over spiritual intervention face charges of heresy or supernatural corruption. Medieval medical education includes extensive religious training that teaches future physicians to interpret all medical phenomena according to theological principles, rather than scientific observation. Students learn to identify different types of demonic possession, to perform various exorcism rituals, to apply religious relics with proper technique, and to integrate prayer therapy with pharmaceutical treatment. The religious training often receives more emphasis than anatomical education or surgical technique. Catherine dies on her 4th day in the monastery, her appendix having burst, and her infection having spread beyond any possibility of survival. Brother Thomas records her death as evidence of particularly powerful demonic attack that required her soul's separation from her body to achieve complete spiritual purification. The religious treatment is considered successful because Catherine died in a state of grace after receiving intensive spiritual care. The monastery's medical success is measured not by patient survival rates or symptom improvement, but by the number of souls saved through religious intervention during medical treatment. Brother Thomas maintains detailed records of spiritual victories, patients who died after confession, families who donated money after receiving religious medical care, and communities that increased their faith after witnessing miraculous healing failures. Medieval medicine's religious foundation creates a closed system of explanation that cannot be contradicted by observed outcomes, protecting ineffective treatments from criticism through supernatural justification. Every medical failure becomes evidence of divine will, every treatment complication proof of demonic resistance, every patient death a victory for spiritual purification over earthly corruption. The saints promised miracles, but the miracles they delivered weren't what anyone expected. They were miracles of sustained suffering, prolonged agony, and sanctified death, disguised as divine intervention in human medical care. The wagon rolls into village squares with the irregular rhythm of broken wheels, carrying death disguised as healing from town to town across medieval Europe. Master Cornelius, traveling surgeon and self-proclaimed physician, arrives with promises of miraculous cures, and leaves behind trails of corpses that mark his passage like breadcrumbs leading to hell. The traveling medical practitioners represent medieval medicine's most mobile form of destruction, bringing sophisticated torture techniques to communities that might otherwise escape systematic medical intervention. Master Cornelius announces his arrival with theatrical fanfare designed to attract patients and their money. He displays certificates of medical training from institutions that don't exist, testimonials from patients who died under his care, and surgical instruments that shine with deadly beauty in morning sunlight. His wagon contains everything necessary to establish temporary medical practice, surgical tools, pharmaceutical preparations, anatomical charts, and a portable torture chamber disguised as a traveling clinic.
Medieval itinerant medicine operates without regulation, oversight, or accountability, creating perfect conditions for charlatans to practice experimental procedures on unsuspecting victims. Traveling physicians move between communities too quickly to be held responsible for treatment outcomes, leaving behind damaged patients and grieving families while moving on to fresh victims in the next village. Their mobility protects them from consequences while maximizing their opportunities for profit through medical fraud. The morning's first patient is Johann, a blacksmith suffering from what modern medicine would recognize as a simple dislocated shoulder, an injury that could be treated with basic manipulation techniques and would heal completely within weeks. Master Cornelius examines Johann's condition and determines that he requires immediate amputation to prevent demonic corruption from spreading throughout his arm, demonstrating the traveling physician's tendency toward unnecessarily aggressive treatment that generates maximum profit. Cornelius's surgical technique reflects the primitive brutality of unsupervised medieval medicine, with procedures performed in village squares using instruments that have never been properly sterilized. Johann's amputation begins with Cornelius heating a saw blade over an open fire, not to sterilize it but to make the cutting process more efficient. The heated metal sears through Johann's flesh and bone, while creating wounds that will never heal properly, guaranteeing future medical complications that will require additional treatment. The traveling physician's pharmaceutical kit contains the standard medieval collection of poisons disguised as medicine, but with concentrations increased to ensure dramatic visible effects that impress potential customers. Cornelius's mercury preparations are twice as concentrated as monastery equivalents. His arsenic medications are formulated for rapid symptom onset, and his bloodletting techniques are designed to remove maximum blood volume in minimum time. Medieval traveling medicine operates as entertainment as much as medical practice, with surgical procedures performed in public to attract crowds and demonstrate the physician's skill. Johann's amputation becomes a theatrical performance, with Cornelius providing commentary on his technique, while spectators observe the systematic dismemberment of a living human being. The public nature of the procedure transforms medical torture into community entertainment. The amputation procedure follows no anatomical logic, with Cornelius cutting through whatever tissue he encounters while searching for the optimal location to sever Johann's arm. Blood flows freely from multiple wounds, but Cornelius interprets the bleeding as evidence that corrupt humors are being expelled from Johann's body along with the infected limb. The lack of proper surgical technique guarantees that Johann will suffer permanent disability even if he survives the immediate procedure. Cornelius's medical credentials consist entirely of forged documents and fictitious testimonials, designed to convince patients of his expertise and training. His claimed education at the University of Paris never occurred. His supposed apprenticeship with famous physicians is completely fabricated, and his alleged medical successes are based on patients who died shortly after receiving his care. The fraudulent credentials allow him to charge premium prices for treatments that would be rejected by any legitimate medical authority. The traveling physician's business model depends on creating medical emergencies that require immediate expensive treatment, transforming minor ailments into life-threatening conditions through deliberate misdiagnosis and unnecessary intervention. Cornelius specializes in convincing healthy patients that they suffer from serious diseases, performing expensive procedures that create actual medical problems, then selling additional treatments to address the complications he has created. Johann's amputation creates multiple secondary medical problems that Cornelius treats as separate conditions requiring additional payment. The infected amputation site requires cauterization treatments that cost extra money. The blood loss needs mercury therapy to restore proper humoral balance. The psychological trauma demands trepanation to release demons that have entered Johann's skull through the shock of surgery. Each complication generates additional profit while worsening Johann's overall condition. Medieval communities have no effective means of evaluating traveling physicians' qualifications or treatment outcomes, creating perfect conditions for medical fraud to flourish without detection. Cornelius's reputation is based entirely on his theatrical presentation and marketing skills, rather than actual medical knowledge or successful patient outcomes. Communities judge his effectiveness by the drama of his procedures, rather than the survival of his patients. The traveling physician's mobility allows him to escape responsibility for treatment failures, while maintaining a reputation for medical expertise in communities that have never witnessed his actual results. By the time patients die from Cornelius's treatments, he has moved on to the next village,
leaving behind families who blame the severity of the original disease rather than the inadequacy of the medical intervention. Cornelius maintains detailed financial records that reveal the economic mathematics of traveling medical fraud. He earns more money from patients who die quickly than from those who recover slowly, creating incentives for treatments that maximize profit through accelerated mortality. His most expensive procedures are invariably his most lethal, reflecting medieval medicine's equation of cost with effectiveness. Johann dies 3 days after his amputation, his body succumbing to infection, blood loss, and mercury poisoning, while Cornelius has already moved on to the next village. The blacksmith's death is attributed to the severity of his original injury, rather than the unnecessary amputation that killed him, protecting Cornelius's reputation while adding another victim to his traveling trail of destruction. The wagon wheels continue their regular rhythm as Master Cornelius approaches the next village. His surgical instruments cleaned of Johann's blood, but not of the bacteria that will infect his next victims. These wandering healers carried more than medical tools. They carried secrets that would reshape our understanding of their true intentions. Golden chalices filled with liquid mercury sit on marble tables, while King Edmund III of Westphalia writhes in agony. His royal flesh no different from peasant meat when subjected to medieval medical treatment. The court physicians surround their sovereign with the same deadly instruments they use on common patients, proving that wealth and political power offer no protection against medical ignorance disguised as elite healthcare. Medieval royal medicine represents the highest form of medical incompetence available, with court physicians applying their most aggressive and expensive treatments to patients who can afford the finest care. Kings and queens receive concentrated doses of the same poisons that kill common folk, administered by physicians whose reputations depend on their ability to create dramatic visible effects in their royal patients. King Edmund's illness began as what modern medicine would recognize as kidney stones. Painful but treatable with proper medical management and entirely survivable with conservative care. But royal medical protocol demands that kings receive treatment worthy of their divine status, requiring the most expensive medications, the most elaborate procedures, and the most aggressive interventions available to medieval medicine. Master Physician Aldrich leads the royal medical team with confidence born of complete ignorance, believing that his position as court physician qualifies him to treat conditions that would challenge modern specialists. His medical training consists primarily of studying ancient texts, memorizing astrological correspondences, and practicing bloodletting techniques on expendable subjects. He has never successfully treated kidney stones, but his theoretical knowledge convinces him that King Edmund requires immediate mercury therapy, followed by surgical intervention. The royal mercury preparation involves dissolving liquid metal in wine imported from France, believing that the quality of the solvent will enhance the spiritual effectiveness of the poison. King Edmund receives doses of mercury far exceeding those given to common patients, reflecting medieval medicine's belief that royal blood requires more potent purification than peasant flesh. The concentrated poison begins its systematic destruction of the king's nervous system, while physicians interpret his resulting symptoms as evidence of successful treatment. Medieval royal medical protocol requires multiple physicians to participate in treatment decisions, creating a system where medical errors are amplified through group consultation, rather than corrected through individual expertise. The court medical team includes specialists in bloodletting, mercury therapy, surgical intervention, and astrological calculation, each contributing their particular form of ignorance to the king's treatment plan. King Edmund's bloodletting session requires the finest instruments available: silver knives instead of bronze, crystal vessels instead of clay, silk bandages instead of rough cloth. The luxury accessories make no difference to the medical procedure's fundamental brutality, but they justify charging prices that exceed annual peasant incomes for treatments that would kill paupers just as efficiently as kings. The Royal Surgical Suite represents medieval medicine's most elaborate attempt to create sterile conditions without understanding the concept of sterility. Silk curtains hang around the king's bed to prevent evil spirits from observing the procedure, while braziers burn exotic incense that supposedly purifies the air of demotic influences. The theatrical staging creates an impression of sophisticated medical care while providing no actual protection against infection or surgical complications. Medieval court physicians maintain detailed records of royal treatments that reveal the mathematical horror of elite medical care. Kings and queens die at rates exceeding those of common patients who receive no medical treatment whatsoever. The concentrated doses of mercury, the aggressive bloodletting protocols, and the elaborate surgical procedures combine to create mortality rates that would appall modern medical administrators. King Edmund's treatment extends beyond individual medical intervention to encompass royal family members who might be affected by supernatural influences. Targeting the monarchy. The Queen receives preventive mercury therapy to protect her from demons that might be attacking her husband. The royal children undergo bloodletting to ensure they don't inherit their father's spiritual corruption. The entire royal bloodline becomes subject to medical intervention that weakens the very genetic legacy it claims to protect. The astrological aspects of royal medical treatment require court physicians to time their interventions according to planetary alignments that supposedly govern royal health. King Edmund's surgery is scheduled for a date when Mars aligns with Jupiter, ensuring maximum spiritual effectiveness for treatments involving blood and metal. The astrological timing delays necessary medical intervention while the king's condition worsens, but medieval medicine prioritizes cosmic considerations over patient survival. Royal medical consultations involve elaborate discussions of theoretical principles rather than practical treatment options, with court physicians demonstrating their learning through complex explanations of supernatural disease mechanisms. The medical team spends hours debating whether King Edmund's kidney stones result from excess hot humours or demonic possession, while the king suffers preventable agony that simple pain relief could alleviate. The surgical removal of King Edmund's kidney stones follows the same primitive techniques used on peasant patients, but with golden instruments that make no functional difference to the procedure's fundamental brutality. The surgery involves cutting into the king's abdomen without anesthesia, searching blindly for stones while causing massive internal damage, then cauterizing wounds with heated metal that destroys healthy tissue along with diseased material. Medieval royal medicine creates its own mythology of success through elaborate record-keeping that documents treatment complexity rather than patient outcomes. Court physicians maintain extensive journals describing the philosophical principles behind their treatments, the astrological calculations that guided their timing, and the theological significance of their procedures, while paying minimal attention to whether their patients survive or recover. King Edmund dies after 6 weeks of intensive royal medical care, his body destroyed by mercury poisoning, blood loss, and surgical trauma that transformed treatable kidney stones into multiple organ failure. The court physicians record his death as evidence of particularly severe demonic attack that required heroic medical intervention, with the king's soul purified through suffering that demonstrated his worthiness for divine salvation. The royal funeral becomes a celebration of medical achievement rather than mourning for treatment failure, with court physicians praised for their dedication to treating supernatural forces that threatened the monarchy. King Edmund's death is attributed to divine will rather than medical incompetence, protecting the physicians' reputations while demonstrating that royal blood offers no protection against the systematic poisoning that passes for elite healthcare. The crown passes to Edmund's son, who inherits not only the throne, but also the court physicians whose treatments killed his father. Medieval royal medicine continues its deadly work, claiming kings and queens with the same efficiency it applies to peasants, proving that death recognizes no social hierarchy when administered through medical ignorance disguised as divine intervention. Even crowns couldn't protect against the physician's cure, and the marble tombs of medieval royalty stand as monuments to medicine's democratic approach to destruction. Candles flicker in the death chamber as Brother Thomas administers last rites to patients whose final moments are transformed into medical emergencies, where dying becomes another opportunity for therapeutic intervention. Medieval deathbed medicine represents the ultimate fusion of medical ignorance and religious doctrine, creating rituals that prolong suffering while claiming to ease the transition from earthly life to spiritual eternity. Medieval physicians understand death not as natural biological process, but as supernatural battle between good and evil forces, fighting for possession of the departing soul. This belief requires medical intervention during dying to ensure that souls are properly purified before leaving their earthly vessels, leading to deathbed procedures that torture patients during their most vulnerable moments. Margaret of Millbrook lies dying in the monastery's terminal ward, her body ravaged by what modern medicine would recognize as cancer, but which Brother Thomas interprets as advanced demonic possession, requiring aggressive treatment until the moment of death. Her final hours become a medical procedure designed to drive evil spirits from her flesh before they can claim her soul for supernatural purposes. The deathbed bloodletting protocol requires physicians to drain corrupt blood from dying patients to prevent demons from using contaminated bodily fluids as spiritual sustenance during the soul's departure. Brother Thomas opens Margaret's veins while she lies conscious, but too weak to resist, believing that her blood must be purified even as her body shuts down. The procedure weakens her already failing cardiovascular system while providing no spiritual benefit beyond the physician's theoretical satisfaction. Medieval understanding of the dying process requires constant medical monitoring to identify the precise moment when demonic influences might attempt to claim departing souls. Brother Thomas maintains vigil at Margaret's bedside, checking her pulse, observing her breathing, and watching for signs that evil spirits are gathering to harvest her consciousness. His medical observations focus on supernatural rather than physical phenomena, missing opportunities to provide comfort while creating additional stress during her final hours. The mercury treatment for dying patients involves administering liquid metal to purify souls that are preparing to leave earthly vessels, believing that spiritual purification must continue until the moment of death. To ensure proper afterlife destination, Margaret receives her final dose of mercury while barely conscious, the poison adding neurological distress to her existing suffering while providing no medical or spiritual benefit. Medieval deathbed surgery represents medicine's most aggressive attempt to intervene in natural dying processes, with physicians performing procedures on patients who are too weak to survive anesthesia, but supposedly require surgical purification of their flesh before spiritual departure. Brother Thomas prepares to perform trepanation on Margaret's skull, believing that demons might be hiding in her brain and planning to escape with her soul. The drilling proceeds despite Margaret's obvious proximity to death, with Thomas boring through her skull while she lies unconscious and dying. The procedure serves no medical purpose and provides no spiritual benefit, but medieval medical protocol requires that all possible treatments be attempted until the moment of death to demonstrate proper medical care and spiritual dedication. Deathbed confession becomes medical procedure as much as religious sacrament, with physicians participating in spiritual counseling to ensure that dying patients achieve proper purification before soul departure. Brother Thomas questions Margaret about sins that might be attracting demonic attention, requiring her to confess to transgressions that exist only in his medical imagination, while she struggles to breathe through failing lungs. The integration of medical and religious authority during deathbed care creates additional opportunities for prolonging suffering while claiming spiritual necessity. Thomas administers religious relics while performing medical procedures, combines prayer with pharmaceutical treatment, and integrates exorcism with surgical intervention, creating elaborate rituals that torture dying patients while providing no therapeutic or spiritual benefit. Medieval deathbed medicine includes family counseling designed to prepare relatives for the supernatural aspects of death, while generating additional income through extended medical services. Thomas explains to Margaret's family that her dying process requires constant medical supervision to prevent demonic interference, charging them for round-the-clock care that consists primarily of watching her suffer through unnecessary medical procedures. The final moments of Margaret's life become a medical emergency requiring immediate intervention to prevent spiritual catastrophe, with Thomas performing last-minute bloodletting while she dies to ensure her blood is properly purified at the moment of soul departure. The procedure serves no medical purpose and occurs too late to provide any spiritual benefit, but medieval protocol requires that physicians remain active until patients are officially declared dead. Medieval understanding of death timing requires physicians to determine the precise moment when souls depart bodies, leading to elaborate procedures for confirming death that often involve additional medical intervention. Thomas monitors Margaret's vital signs while performing tests designed to detect spiritual departure, pricking her with needles, applying heat to her skin, and observing her responses to determine whether her soul has completed its journey to the afterlife. The death certificate becomes medical document as much as legal record, with Thomas documenting not only the cause of death, but also the spiritual circumstances surrounding Margaret's departure. His records describe the supernatural forces involved in her dying, the medical procedures performed to assist her soul's purification, and the evidence suggesting that demonic influences were successfully expelled before spiritual departure. Margaret's death occurs after 18 hours of continuous medical intervention during her dying process, with Thomas maintaining active treatment until her heart stops beating. The final hours involve more medical procedures than many patients receive during months of treatment, transforming natural death into elaborate medical emergency that prolongs suffering, while claiming spiritual necessity. the deathbed becomes operating theatre, where dying patients undergo final medical procedures designed to prepare their souls for supernatural departure. Each death represents another opportunity for medical intervention, another chance to demonstrate therapeutic dedication, another excuse for charging families premium prices for services that torture patients during their most vulnerable moments. Medieval deathbed medicine creates its own mythology of spiritual success, through elaborate documentation of supernatural phenomena that allegedly occur during dying processes enhanced by medical intervention. Thomas maintains detailed records of souls that were successfully purified through deathbed procedures, families that were properly prepared for spiritual departure, and communities that witnessed miraculous deathbed healing through medical intervention. But in their final moments, some patients whispered something that would change everything we thought we knew about medieval medicine. Secrets that revealed the true nature of physicians' motivations and the hidden knowledge that drove their systematic torture of human bodies. In the deepest recesses of monastery archives, hidden beneath layers of official medical records, lies evidence that medieval physicians were not the ignorant healers history portrays them to be. The survivors, those rare patients who lived through medieval medical treatment, carried secrets that wouldn't be understood for centuries, secrets that reveal a darker truth about the systematic torture disguised as healing. Elena of Raven's Hollow survived 6 months of mercury treatment, 4 bloodletting sessions, and 2 trepanation procedures before physicians declared her cured of demonic possession. But Elena's whispered confessions to trusted friends reveal a different story. She survived not because of medical treatment, but in spite of it, and what she learned during her ordeal suggests that some physicians knew exactly what they were doing to their patients. The secret documents hidden in monastery walls contain evidence that medieval physicians maintained 2 sets of medical records: official accounts that describe supernatural healing and spiritual purification, and private notes that document the actual effects of their treatments on human physiology. These hidden records reveal that physicians understood the connection between mercury and neurological damage, between bloodletting and weakened immunity, between trepanation and brain injury. Brother Thomas's private journal, discovered centuries later during monastery renovations, contains observations that contradict his official medical reports. In his secret writings, he describes mercury as the destroyer of minds, notes that bloodletting weakens more than it heals, and refers to trepanation as the opening of death's doorway. These private observations suggest that Thomas understood the true effects of his treatments while maintaining public facades of supernatural healing. The survivors' testimonies, collected through careful historical research, reveal patterns of physician behavior that suggest deliberate harm disguised as medical treatment. Elena reports that Brother Thomas smiled when her mercury dose was increased, that he seemed pleased when her condition worsened after bloodletting, and that he expressed satisfaction when her personality changed following trepanation. These behavioral observations suggest that physicians derived psychological satisfaction from their patients' suffering. Medieval medical guild records, preserved in scattered archives, contain evidence of systematic training in psychological manipulation techniques designed to make patients compliant during torture procedures. Physicians learned how to use religious authority to justify inflicting pain, how to interpret patient suffering as spiritual purification, and how to maintain emotional detachment while administering treatments they knew would cause permanent damage. The economic records of medieval medical institutions reveal financial incentives that encouraged physicians to prolong patient suffering rather than provide effective treatment. Monasteries generated more income from patients who required extended treatment, families paid higher fees for dramatic medical procedures, and physicians received bonuses for performing the most aggressive interventions regardless of patient outcomes. Elena's account describes witnessing conversations between physicians who discuss their treatments in language that suggests complete awareness of their destructive effects. She overheard Brother Thomas telling a colleague that mercury provides reliable symptom generation, that bloodletting ensures patient compliance through weakness, and that trepanation produces permanent behavioral modification. These conversations suggest that physicians understood their treatments as forms of behavioral control rather than medical healing. The monastery's financial records correlate patient mortality rates with institutional profitability, revealing that death rates increased during periods when the monastery faced financial pressure. This correlation suggests that physicians may have deliberately increased treatment aggressiveness to generate more revenue, using patient desperation as economic opportunity rather than medical emergency. Survivor accounts describe physicians exhibiting behavioral patterns consistent with sadistic personality disorders, deriving pleasure from inflicting pain, showing excitement when treatments caused dramatic symptoms, and demonstrating emotional detachment that protected them from empathy with patient suffering. These behavioral observations suggest that medieval medicine attracted individuals who were psychologically suited for inflicting systematic torture. The preserved letters between medieval physicians contain discussions of patient responses that suggest experimental attitudes toward human suffering. Physicians shared observations about which treatments produced the most dramatic effects, compared techniques for maximizing patient pain, and exchanged information about methods for prolonging suffering while maintaining patient consciousness. These communications suggest that medieval medicine operated as a laboratory for human experimentation disguised as therapeutic intervention. Elena's testimony describes overhearing Brother Thomas discussing his treatments with visiting physicians who expressed admiration for his ability to maintain patient compliance during obviously torturous procedures. The conversations focused on psychological techniques for convincing patients that their suffering served spiritual purposes, suggesting that physicians understood their role as manipulators rather than healers. The architectural evidence from medieval medical facilities reveals design features that prioritize physician safety and patient confinement, rather than healing environments. Medical chambers were designed like prison cells, surgical theaters resembled torture chambers, and patient quarters were constructed to contain screaming rather than promote recovery. These design choices suggest that medieval medical institutions were built for systematic abuse rather than therapeutic intervention. Medieval medical literature contains subtle references to the psychological satisfaction physicians derived from their treatments, described in language that suggests they understood the non-medical nature of their procedures. Texts refer to the pleasure of purification, the satisfaction of spiritual cleansing, and the joy of demonic expulsion, in terms that suggest physicians enjoyed the process of inflicting suffering on helpless patients. The survivor testimonies reveal that some patients understood they were being systematically tortured, but lacked the social power to resist medical authority. Elena describes feeling certain that her treatments were making her worse while being unable to refuse them due to religious and social pressure. Her account suggests that the medieval medical system operated through coercion and manipulation rather than genuine healing intent. The hidden medical records document systematic experimentation on human subjects using treatments that physicians knew would cause specific types of damage. Different mercury concentrations were tested to determine optimal dosages for neurological destruction. Bloodletting protocols were varied to establish maximum blood loss before death, and trepanation techniques were refined to achieve precise forms of brain damage. Elena's final testimony, recorded shortly before her death from mercury poisoning complications, contains her most disturbing revelation. She believed that medieval physicians were not ignorant healers, but knowledgeable torturers who used medical authority to inflict systematic suffering on populations that trusted them with their lives. Her dying words suggest that medieval medicine represented one of history's most successful forms of institutional sadism. The survivors carried secrets that wouldn't be understood for centuries, but their whispered testimonies reveal the true nature of medieval medical practice as systematic torture disguised as divine healing, administered by individuals who understood exactly what they were doing to their victims. The fluorescent lights of modern hospitals cast sterile illumination on medical practices that would be immediately recognizable to Brother Thomas. Despite 7 centuries of supposed progress, the instruments have changed, the theories have evolved, but the fundamental willingness to inflict suffering in the name of healing persists in forms that medieval physicians would admire for their sophistication and efficiency. Contemporary medical practice retains medieval medicine's most dangerous characteristic: the belief that aggressive intervention demonstrates superior caring, regardless of patient outcomes. Modern physicians prescribe multiple medications that interact in ways no one fully understands, perform surgeries that carry mortality rates exceeding the diseases they claim to treat, and maintain treatment protocols that prioritize institutional liability over patient welfare. The modern pharmaceutical industry operates according to principles that medieval apothecaries would recognize. Profitability increases with toxicity, the most expensive medications produce the most dramatic side effects, and patients are encouraged to consume multiple substances simultaneously without comprehensive understanding of their interactions. Contemporary prescription protocols create polypharmacy patterns that mirror medieval physicians' enthusiasm for administering multiple poisons simultaneously. Modern cancer treatment employs chemotherapy agents, that are literally classified as hazardous waste, administered to patients whose immune systems are already compromised by malignant disease. The treatment protocol involves poisoning patients with substances so toxic that healthcare workers require protective equipment to handle them safely, while patients are expected to allow these poisons to be injected directly into their bloodstreams. Contemporary psychiatric medicine uses chemical interventions that alter brain chemistry in ways that are not fully understood, creating dependency relationships that mirror medieval physicians' use of mercury to control patient behavior. Modern antidepressants, antipsychotics, and mood stabilizers produce neurological changes that can become permanent, representing contemporary versions of medieval brain modification through pharmaceutical rather than surgical means. The modern medical education system trains physicians to maintain emotional detachment from patient suffering, teaching future doctors to view human bodies as mechanical systems, rather than conscious beings capable of experiencing pain and fear. This emotional distancing mirrors medieval physicians' ability to perform brutal procedures while maintaining spiritual justification for their actions. Contemporary medical institutions operate according to economic models that prioritize revenue generation over patient outcomes, creating financial incentives for prolonged treatment rather than efficient healing. Hospitals generate more profit from patients who require extended stays, multiple procedures, and expensive interventions, echoing medieval monasteries' financial dependence on prolonged patient suffering. Modern surgical practices retain medieval medicine's enthusiasm for invasive intervention, with procedures performed based on statistical benefits that may not apply to individual patients. Contemporary surgery often involves removing healthy tissue to prevent potential future problems, reflecting medieval physicians' willingness to inflict immediate harm to address theoretical future risks. The pharmaceutical industry's research and development process mirrors medieval physicians' experimental approach to human subjects, with new medications tested on populations who may not fully understand the risks involved. Contemporary clinical trials often involve administering substances with unknown long-term effects to patients whose desperation makes them vulnerable to exploitation. Modern medical authority maintains the same religious-like reverence that protected medieval physicians from criticism, with patients discouraged from questioning treatment protocols or seeking alternative approaches. Contemporary medical practice operates through institutional authority that discourages patient autonomy and independent medical decision-making. The modern healthcare system's treatment of terminal patients mirrors medieval deathbed medicine's tendency to transform dying into medical emergencies, requiring aggressive intervention. Contemporary end-of-life care often involves prolonging suffering through technological means while claiming to provide compassionate care, echoing medieval physicians' tendency to torture patients during their final moments. Contemporary medical research prioritizes developing new treatments over improving existing ones, reflecting medieval medicine's fascination with elaborate procedures rather than simple, effective intervention. Modern pharmaceutical companies invest more resources in creating patentable new medications than in ensuring optimal use of existing treatments. The modern medical system's approach to mental health employs pharmaceutical interventions that alter brain chemistry in ways that mirror medieval physicians' use of mercury and other toxic substances to modify behavior and personality. Contemporary psychiatric medications can cause permanent neurological changes that affect patients' ability to think, feel, and function normally. Modern medical practice maintains medieval medicine's tendency to treat symptoms rather than underlying causes, using technological sophistication to disguise approaches that remain fundamentally similar to medieval physicians' symptomatic interventions. Contemporary medicine excels at managing chronic conditions rather than curing them, creating dependent patient populations that require ongoing medical supervision. The contemporary medical system's integration with insurance and governmental authority creates coercive relationships that mirror medieval medicine's integration with religious authority. Patients face financial and legal pressure to accept medical treatments they might prefer to refuse, echoing medieval patients' inability to resist medical authority backed by religious doctrine. Modern medical institutions maintain the same architectural features that characterized medieval medical facilities: patient confinement areas, specialized chambers for painful procedures, and design elements that prioritize institutional control over patient comfort. Contemporary hospitals are built for staff efficiency rather than patient healing, reflecting medieval medical facilities' emphasis on physician convenience over patient welfare. The modern pharmaceutical industry's marketing practices employ psychological manipulation techniques that mirror medieval physicians' use of religious authority to convince patients to accept harmful treatments. Contemporary drug advertisements create fear of untreated conditions while promising relief through pharmaceutical intervention, echoing medieval physicians' use of supernatural threats to justify medical torture. Contemporary medical research continues medieval medicine's tradition of documenting treatment complexity rather than patient outcomes, with modern medical literature focusing on procedural sophistication rather than actual healing effectiveness. Medical journals publish studies that demonstrate technical advancement while providing minimal evidence of improved patient welfare. The shadow of medieval medicine still reaches into our modern world, and what it touches might surprise you. The same willingness to inflict systematic suffering in the name of healing, the same institutional structures that protect medical authority from criticism, and the same fundamental belief that aggressive intervention demonstrates superior caring regardless of actual outcomes. The instruments have evolved, the theories have been updated, but the essential character of medical practice remains remarkably similar to what Brother Thomas would recognize as familiar approaches to human suffering, disguised as divine intervention.